Hello, welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. My name is Joe Devine, and today I was delighted to be joined by Alex Stewart, Michael Bailey of The Athletic, and Uncle Damien. That's right, my Uncle Damien, who is a long-time Norwich City fan, season ticket holder, away traveller, all the rest of it. So we thought we'd bring Uncle Damien along to give the fans' perspective on today's episode, which is all about Norwich City. Now, of course, Michael Bailey, I'm reading now from The Athletic's biography of Michael Bailey. Michael Bailey is a true Norfolkian and Norwich City correspondent for The Athletic. He previously worked for the Beacon and the Eastern Daily Press, covering the Canaries home and away since 2007, winning regional and national awards for his coverage in the process, as well as being in the Carrow Road stands since the age of 8. So yes, today's episode, joined by Uncle Damien and Michael Bailey, is all about Norwich City. Now, of course, Norwich had a fantastic start to the season. They played tremendous football all of last season in the Championship. Alex and I had expected great and big things from them this year, but things have halted since, well, I guess mid-September, so a couple of months now. They are sitting in the relegation zone as we speak, and they got a big December month coming ahead. So today's discussion is about what's going wrong, what could be done to improve that. Teemu, Pukki, Emil Buendia, the kind of relationship between the two of them. Michael talks about his trip to Finland to go and visit Pukki's hometown and speak to friends and family and all the rest of it. We also talk a lot about Delia Smith, who's one of the owners or one of the majority shareholders of Norwich City. So for supporters from overseas, or listeners to this podcast, I should say, from overseas, who perhaps aren't so au fait with Norwich City or maybe don't know who Delia Smith is, we talk about Delia Smith too, and Stuart Webber, who is the sporting director at the club. I had a lovely time. I hope you do too. And before we get on with the podcast, let me first say that we are supported by The Athletic, the best place to read about football online. Get a 30-day free trial and 50% off your annual subscription by visiting theathletic.co.uk/Tifo, 8p a day. It's really, really worth it. And if you're a Norwich City fan particularly, Michael's writing has been fantastic and enjoyable to read. And if you leave today's episode thinking, I want to hear more of that guy, The Athletic is the place to do so. But yeah, without further ado, here is today's episode. Thank you for downloading. Michael Bailey, thanks so much for coming. Really
Cheers,
appreciate it. Also, Uncle Damien's here.
Hello.
Hello, Uncle Damien. How are you?
I'm fine.
Good. We thought it'd be nice to have Uncle Damien along because Uncle Damien, who's been referenced on the podcast before, is a big-time Norwich fan. You're a season ticket holder, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely.
How long has that been the case?
25 years.
Crikey. Okay. There you go. And also, you've been going to lots of away games this year.
Yes. Make the most of the Premiership season.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to start, isn't it? Alex, you're also here.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Yeah.
Good. Right, Michael, let's start by saying that Alex and I are big admirers of Norwich. We talked about Norwich a lot last season. We talked about Norwich a lot over the summer. It's fair to say that we did quite a lot of bigging up of Norwich because we're big fans of the way that Norwich play.
Why have you made us look stupid?
Why have you made us look stupid? Of course, there have been injury issues as well, but in your opinion, what's happened? Because it's not been the best start.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, they've also made me look stupid in a way. And I spent all summer bigging up Emil Buendia, and I'm trying to work out where he's gone and who the one is that suddenly turned up playing on the pitch. I say in jest. It's not even where it's gone wrong this season, is it? It's literally where it's gone wrong since the middle of September.
Yeah.
And maybe that is part of it, because you could possibly argue some teams took them slightly lightly in the opening 6 weeks of the season. No one's doing that now. And Norwich haven't really adapted to how Premier League sides are, closing them, pressing them, shutting down the things they do well. I think no one's taking them lightly. And I haven't really seen Norwich adapt to that yet in any way. They're still trying to do the same things. And I get entirely that they have a way they want to play, but by the same token, you have to evolve. They evolved last season during the Premier League. They evolved, during the Championship, and they evolved for taking on Manchester City in the Premier League this year. So they've got to do something a little bit different. But I mean, there's so many facets to it. Like you say, the injury crisis, and the crisis was really because it hit specific areas. I mean, losing 3 of your 4 recognised centre-backs basically from the start of the season to about now, is it would hurt any side. They have players back now. They're not quite at full strength yet, but by the same token, there are players in that team who aren't really playing at a level that we would have expected either. And I think everyone was kind of hoping, hence the amount of faith they put in that squad last year, that the step up would come quicker than it has. That there are a few players there who are struggling more than we all thought, and especially in terms of the things they were supposed to be strong at. This is a possession-based side. They're supposed to be technically really proficient. Last year, the question marks were over their physicality. Yeah. I mean, this year there is a massive question mark over their physicality, I think, throughout the entire side. But also, they're not keeping the ball very well, and at times they don't look particularly technically proficient for the Premier League level. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of question marks in terms of how the season develops from here, and a bit of it is hoping that it is just a confidence issue, that maybe a spark will get them back to what they looked like a few weeks ago.
I remember watching them. They played the opening game of the season, didn't they? It was against Liverpool. I remember watching it and thinking, brilliant, this is the Norwich that we've been waiting to see. I was delighted that although they lost the game, they had such a great go at it, and I thought that was going to give them a real confidence boost going into the rest of the season. I feel like there's also been a pattern when they've played against, it's dropped off recently, but there had been a pattern when they played against the bigger teams in the league. Do you think there's one aspect of it is that they are set up quite well in a way to be a sort of surprising team against other teams like Liverpool, yet when they play teams closer to their position within the league, that's when things really start to fall apart?
I think that's what the evidence looks like to a degree. I mean, the Man United game is an interesting one in that respect, because I think a lot of Norwich fans went into that thinking, oh, hello, we've got a chance here. And normally they would never think that against United, and suddenly they play a team who actually found a bit of swagger. And it has been quite crucial in terms of Norwich going behind or getting ahead of themselves in terms of how the whole dynamic of the game has gone from there. And I know that generally happens anyway, but certainly it's been quite profound for Norwich this season. But I do honestly find it quite hard to reconcile everything pre-Man City to post, because I do think that was a defining result in terms of how Norwich went about it. And the way Norwich beat the press against Manchester City, they haven't even looked close to doing that against any other side. Yeah. So it's like that to me, you can see teams being much more focused on Norwich's holding midfielder and the role they play in getting out of the press. And I guess when you lose your confidence, even the simple passes become a lot harder, never mind actually combining to make them, which again is something, it's really surprised me how there's such a lack of combining passes to create moves or to even get up the pitch. So it's quite basic things, and it's a real test for Daniel Farke, who has a load of credit in the bank. He's done a brilliant job so far, but the way he coaches the side from here on in is going to be a real indicator as to how good he really is, because to battle that kind of momentum is very difficult.
Yeah. Alex, on that point about maybe there was a difference in the game against United, do you feel that it has something to do with the way in which Norwich play? So, for example, against teams like Liverpool and Man City, who are going to have a lot more possession, they might serve better against Man United, who play much better on the counter-attack. There are going to be problems there. What do you think?
Possibly. I think it's a really interesting point, because when you look at how Norwich played in the Championship, there was a kind of automaton style in a good way. Everything seemed so incredibly fluid and rehearsed, but in the best possible way. You know, there was room for moments of excellence and you know, kind of extemporizing, but they seemed like a team that really knitted well together. They all knew where they were supposed to be going, and that's just kind of unfolded, and that was part of that kind of relentlessness of their approach. And so when you look at how they're stuttering now, and as you said, Michael, you know, kind of things that might apparently be simple, you know, finding the right person to break a press or making the right run, that kind of thing, it feels like that is a mentality thing rather than a tactical thing. The manner of playing is trying to be the same, but there's something that's not quite clicking, and the fall off in terms of, because I agree with the Liverpool game, you know, it was the exciting thing about that Liverpool game was they've just turned up, they've played this scintillating way in the Championship, and they're doing exactly the same thing, and this is amazing. And you know, that kind of narrative of we're not going to compromise on our style, we're going to continue playing the same way whoever we're against, but it's not working, and it's not working for sort of technical reasons rather than stylistic reasons, which I find really quite difficult to explain.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we attempt to do on the podcast when teams are having a problem is to work out whether it is systematic or whether it's maybe more personnel based, if there are confidence issues or things like that. Damien, view from the stands. Here we go. I love it. It's a supporter's view from the stands. What do you think? I mean, as Alex says, they've been, and as Michael said as well, been trying to play the same way throughout the entire season. That is and isn't working at different times. Do you think it might be sort of personnel issue? Are there confidence issues there? Do you see particular players when you're watching the game, so you think, well, they're making obvious errors?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the wrong players got injured.
Right.
As the point that you mentioned earlier on. And that's had an impact and a knock-on.
Yeah.
And I think that's gone into individual players' confidence.
Yeah.
We're talking about Buendia, and he comes back and he's not the same player. And maybe the Man City game just happened too early in the season, which is, it can't be accounted for.
You mentioned before, we were talking about this beforehand, that there's a big month of December, and that maybe the way that you look at it is that this is not necessarily a make or break period, but it's very important, obviously, to pick up results here. Presumably, as well, getting on a little run like that might dissuade any of those confidence issues that are there at the moment.
Well, it needs to be reversed and quickly.
Yeah.
We've got 7 games, I think, in December. Obviously, we've got Arsenal as well at the beginning of December. So I know that you always take stock at the end of the year, halfway through the season. So the injured players need to come back, but they also need to get match fit and get their form back.
Yeah.
And quickly. Otherwise, it might start slipping away.
Yeah. Another thing we said beforehand was, and look, it's obviously it's very early in the season. We don't want to commit Norwich to a relegation battle, but it is fair to say that might be the way that it's going. One way of looking at it, as we discussed beforehand, was in that case, all you have to do is be better than 3 other teams. Michael, do you see 3 other teams in the Premier League that you can beat this year?
Well, let's be clear, Norwich are in a relegation battle. I hate this thing of only worrying about a relegation battle when you get to sort of March, because, in terms of trends, Norwich still need 8 wins for the rest of the season to get to 30 points minimum. So, and they've got, 12 fewer games to do that in. So there's pressure that comes from the season passing. I've said this all season, actually, since before things got going. It looks an incredibly strong Premier League, and I mean that almost in terms of all the established sides. There seems to be a premium. People have spent money pretty wisely in general. Clubs seem to be a little bit more keen about how they're going to be run. I guess the latest TV deal and the sort of acceleration of money, they've got over the initial thrill of spending it all, and actually now that money has had a profound effect on the quality of the sides compared to the Championship, I suppose. And
yeah.
I mean, I'm saying all this, and then I just have ringing in my head Sheffield United. That's the problem I've got with everything, with every way I try to rationalise it, and it does scream just how great a job Chris Wilder is doing there, and in terms of the way he's coaching his side to be really hard to beat.
Yeah.
But in terms of Norwich don't have the budget of Sheffield United either. There were elements that Norwich were weaker than Sheffield United last year in terms of having to work from behind more often, conceding more goals, that I think have probably given them even though they were champions, has given Norwich a tougher task in the Premier League.
Yeah.
And so in answer, I've really struggled with that question all season. I mean, you look at Newcastle thinking, well, they might be one of the worst ones. Norwich kind of turned them over relatively easily, but they've still spent huge amounts of money in the window, and they've got some real quality there to be able to get themselves going. Brighton, again, they've beaten Norwich with ease. And Graham Potter, who is a very good coach, and I know a lot of people at Norwich like Graham Potter for quite a few years, he's done a really good job of moulding them. And Southampton are in a crisis, and it's like only teams in a crisis, you're starting to think maybe Norwich could finish above them. That's being brutally honest as we all sit here.
What do you reckon,
really
Alex?
tough.
Well, as I said to Michael before we started recording, please don't smile at me when you ask me a question like that.
I can't help it.
I was at the Everton game, and we were
Against Southampton.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, just to be clear.
Yeah. And it was awful. So yes, I would say
That's
quite possibly. I mean, I agree that the Premier League is looking unusually strong. I think so far this season there's been a degree of variety in results. Nothing seems terribly predictable, but it's all. I mean, the only side that we talked about towards the end of last season, with that pot of teams that were possibly looking to push up and disrupt the top 6, quote unquote, is Watford. Obviously, they've had an absolutely terrible start to the season. Probably the only other massive surprise would be Spurs underperforming. other than that, everyone looks pretty good most of the time. And you've got, I think, crucially, Brighton and Bournemouth, who you'd maybe consider to be one of those potential sort of slip up and down teams. They both look very, very strong, particularly Brighton. I agree with our next tactics videos on Brighton, so I've been watching quite a lot of them recently. And it is difficult to see. I mean, we very firmly nailed our colours to the mast after the three promoted teams were sorted out, that Norwich were the strongest and most likely to stay up. And so that went well. But I mean, I agree with you. Chris Wilder's doing a brilliant job. I still don't quite understand why teams are finding him so difficult to play against. And I get extremely fed up with people talking about overlapping centre-backs like it's this incredible innovation that's somehow unfathomable. It's clever, but it's not unfathomable. And I don't understand why it's posing teams so many issues. Whereas Norwich are very good, but I think stylistically, they're more similar to enough other teams than a Sheffield United are to be easier to unpick in terms of opposition preparation.
I mean, Sheffield United are so resolute, and there's such they're intangibles, really, aren't they, in terms of just how thick they are to beat. And although Norwich had lots of come from behind goals and lots of inner belief, I wouldn't have necessarily said at any point they were really like a brick wall, rugged. And it's, again, that I don't know. I mean, Chris Wilder probably knows how you coach that, but that they look the same at this level, which again is why probably tactically it's not quite so easy to unpick. But just as a unit, there's something there. Away from home, the first team in 30 years, is it 25 years to go, 6 games unbeaten as a newly promoted side in the Premier League. I mean, that's ridiculous stat. I mean, Norwich have got a point, and it came from a game which has sort of been hailed as an improvement in performance against Bournemouth, and Norwich did for the first time look a bit more collective in what they were doing. Bournemouth were pretty dire that day as well, and also they've reacted by beating United at Dean Court since. So, it's Norwich feel really easy to beat in transition. They leave masses of spaces a lot of the time. They kind of give things up. Yeah. And in the end, if your belief is driving you on to get yourself back into a game, that's going to keep taking a hit if you just keep finding yourself so open and exposed. And I think you end up looking at each other at that point.
Damien and I watched the goals from the Brighton game over the weekend, and the first goal, the Delia goal, it's just so bad. That's with Watford, sorry. It's just so
within
bad.
2 minutes. Yeah. And Ben Godfrey's gone on overlap. So
I know there's a runner taking the defenders away, but there's 3 or 4 defenders there, and they just open up meters of space in the penalty box, and you think
after 92 seconds.
That's understandable if it's towards the end of a game and you're exhausted and you've been chasing the ball, but there's something wrong there.
But this is like what you were saying about Southampton, is that when I watched us against Everton, conceded after 4 minutes, I think, Tom Davis at the back, who had a fantastic game for Everton. But it was the lack of passing options. When the centre-backs were winning the ball, particularly Stevens, was sort of not sure whether to carry it. There wasn't a passing option on. People were static. They weren't looking. And you can watch how a team sort of moves around the pitch and relates to itself, how the players relate to each other. And that's the sort of thing that gives you cause for concern. When people start looking at each other, when people start not moving for the ball, not showing for it. And that's when I think like you said, it becomes intangibles. It's not necessarily to do with tactics. It's to do with mentality and those things that it sometimes gets a bit cliche, wanting it more and so on. And it's, it's hard to measure and so on, but you can infer things from players' body language or the way that they're looking for things. And I think, Southampton from that perspective are in crisis. Norwich, maybe a bit.
There's an interesting thing to take from the tactics though, because we were speaking on last week's podcast about Liverpool and the differences between Liverpool and City, and how potentially losing a goal or missing an opportunity, missing a chance for Liverpool is
it's more significant because
it's more significant.
They create fewer chances.
They create fewer chances, and the goals that they score are worth more technically to their points than Manchester City's are. In a similar vein, looking at the differences between United and Norwich coming up, Norwich play and I'm going to ask you in a second, Alex, to just talk a little bit about how Norwich do play for those listeners who haven't been watching all season or indeed last season. But there's an interesting idea that Norwich play in a particular style which enabled them to finish in a higher position than United did in the Championship last year, but that doesn't necessarily transition to the Premier League in the same way. Do you see what I'm saying? There might be a style of football that United play which means that they don't win the Championship, but they're much more likely to stay up in the Premier League. It's an odd way of looking at it, that your highest position doesn't necessarily mean you're the better team, depending on what league you're in. But would you just tell me a little bit about how Norwich do play, or how they're attempting to play at the moment?
Yeah, I think to answer your first point quickly, there is a lot in that regard to do with resilience. And I think people have sort of assumed, and I think this is a point you made in a recent article actually, that if you have a goal scorer who's going to get 10 or 15 goals, that in itself is a really strong indication of the likelihood of surviving. And perhaps people undervalue the qualities of defence and goalkeeper and so on in terms of avoiding relegation, that it's about buying a goal scorer or bringing a goal scorer with you in the case of Pukki. And it's really interesting to see how much Norwich are throwing weight behind trying to, make him happy and make him feel part of. I mean, I'm sure he does, but this whole thing with the Finnish national team was very interesting in that regard. So I think Sheffield United.
What was that?
Oh, so you'll know better than I will. It's probably easier if you explain.
Yeah, they're going to have a Pukki party. Norwich are going to have an official Pukki party in Finland.
Okay.
And so they basically, the club are going over to Finland. They've had good talks with people over there, and basically to lend their support to Finland's bid for history to qualify for their first major finals, which they can do against Liechtenstein on Friday night, which are in their win list. So it should happen. So I don't think Norwich would ever want anyone doing it to them, sort of going like, we think you're going to go up, so we're going to have a massive party. But fair play to Norwich. There's obviously massive commercial benefits. There's a piece on the Athletic about it.
They're going to make a documentary, aren't they?
They are going to make a documentary as well, and all sorts.
In Helsinki.
Yeah. So, and I went to Finland obviously in August to find out a bit about Teemu's background.
Well, I tell you what, this is the perfect point to do our little advert, if you don't mind, for the Athletic. One of the things we do like to do when we have athletic journalists on halfway through the podcast is talk a little bit about an article that they've written. And I was going to ask you about your trip to Finland, because I enjoyed reading that. What was it like to go there?
It was amazing. It was such a whirlwind, given that, what was it, the second weekend of the season? Realistically, I'd only been at the Athletic for a few weeks. I got a message after from the boss after Teemu scored his first goal saying, I think you might have to go to Finland. By the time he'd scored his third, it was in capital letters. Wow. You are going to Finland. Yeah. So, okay, right, fair enough. And to take on 4 days in a country I'd never been to before. The only two people I knew were two Finnish journos who had been over to Norwich the season before to interview us about Teemu. And basically sort of kept going backwards and forwards between Helsinki and Kotka, which is where Teemu grew up. It was a blast. Everyone was so proud of Teemu. Everyone was so open and friendly and helpful. I've never known anything like it in terms of organising interviews and people to speak to. And, it's just some profound stuff about the impact Teemu Pukki's had over there on Finnish football, but also his journey. I think there were a lot. It was all great then. It's a bit trickier now that he hasn't scored for a while, but, his pedigree throughout the moment he first broke into youth football to going to Sevilla and all of those things, he has a real pedigree and real quality about him. And even now he's struggling at Norwich. I don't think that's about him per se. I think it's about people trying to stop him by stopping everyone else, and the people around him are not really showing up for him in that regard. But I think there is a real pedigree there, and fair play to Norwich for having the bravery to be the ones to bring him to England. And he always looked too good for the Championship last year, and I think it was really a really warm and friendly visit, and everyone was just so happy to talk about him. They're so proud of him, and personally, having done that, completed that trip and enjoyed it, I really hope they do the business on Friday night.
I guess on Pukki as well, we know he can do it. As you said, it's probably more about the stopping, getting the ball to him, or... It's a bit of a shame, really, isn't it? Because when he came out of the gates early on in the season, I had him in my fantasy football team as my captain for the first couple of weeks. But for the first week, on your suggestion, Damien, and I was delighted. And I thought there's something very interesting about about the way that he does actually play. He's quite a functional player, and the goals that he scores, the speed that he gets up to, when you look at him, you sort of think you shouldn't really be able to do any of that. He doesn't look like Aguero, does he? But he, I love the little, and we did a piece on this as well, a video at the time about his little link up with Buendia. Every goal he scores is a weirdly kind of floor-based, strange angle, off an angle that you think physically he shouldn't be able to achieve the kind of pace that he does. He's a fantastic player. Alex, what's happened? Is it a case of, as Michael says, that the supply to him has been throttled?
I think so. I mean, when we asked before about tactics, so Norwich like to generate width from the fullbacks, and with Aarons and Lewis, these two very young, very dynamic attacking players. Godfrey also was able to carry the ball forwards to break the press quite a lot. You'd have a defensive midfielder dropping in, and they would be able to start building the play at the back, sometimes quite slowly, patiently, but then there would be this explosion forwards, and it was predicated a lot on pace, quick interchanges of passing, and the attacking three midfielders would sort of concertina in and move around a lot and try and effectively create these passing angles through their movement, so that Pukki would be, and this was the point that we made in the video, the angle of the pass and the angle of Pukki's run would they wouldn't be the same, but they'd intersect at a point, and then he would be able to turn. And I think you made a point recently in terms of the diminishing return of his finishing, and he scored those 5-6 goals at the beginning of the season from quite a considerably lower XG. So he was converting chances that not that he shouldn't have converted, but that it's an unsustainable rate for him. But I do think if you can pin the fullbacks back, and this is a trend that we've seen in the Premier League. All kinds of teams are doing this now. United have done it against Liverpool, for example. There are some teams who generate most of their forward momentum from their fullbacks. And if you can get those fullbacks to stay by having men up there, pushing them back, pressing them, whatever it is, and crucially, I think, denying the inside pass option for them, then you can prevent a lot of that go forwards. That's where Norwich would get their width from, because none of those three attacking midfielders are particularly wide players. I mean, Cantwell can come out wide, but generally speaking, they want to be creating little kind of diamonds or triangles of passing options in front of the opposition penalty box. They don't want to play out wide, because that's what the fullbacks were doing. And I think in some regards, this goes back to what we were saying about how teams can be easier to play against, and the difference between a team that is extraordinarily well organised and well drilled, but also has physicality, resilience, and does something that is a little bit unusual, versus a team that is very slick and very fast, but is basically, and this is what happened with Norwich in the Championship a lot, they're looking to steamroller teams. They're looking to, through a combination of pace, quick passing, and having a really good striker, they're looking to just wash over a side, even if they concede a few themselves. That doesn't really work in the Premier League, partly because a sort of slick positional passing 4-2-3-1 is a formation that's really familiar to Premier League sides. It's a lot easier to solve as a puzzle, and we've talked before about, football tactics are basically you set a question to the opposition and they try and solve it. And I think Norwich's question is a lot simpler to solve for a variety of reasons than Sheffield United's is. So,
well, on Pukki then, if you would like to read Michael's piece about his visit to Finland, you can visit www.theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Get a 30-day free trial and 50% off an annual subscription. How much is that? 8p a day?
I believe it is.
8p a day. Yeah, or you could go to Michael's personal one, which is only 40% off, which isn't as good as ours, is it?
No, that's true.
There you go. Yeah. I would like to ask you about Stuart Webber, who is the footballing director. Is that
Sporting
his
director?
Sporting director. Okay.
Same difference.
Will you tell me what he does and where you found him? Because he's done a great job, hasn't he?
Well, I found him at a press conference. He was just sat there, and it was lovely.
It's a wonderful fun.
Norwich found him at Huddersfield, where he was doing a similar job, but not quite the same, because he had Dean Hoyle ahead of him, who was a very active owner and probably more of a chief exec under Stewart. So Stewart's probably combined those roles at Norwich. He is one of a 3-person exec committee, basically running the club day to day. Football is Stewart's department, so he looked after everything to do with football, really, from the performance, first team, academy, signing players, recruiting players. As a 3, they also have input into the other sides of the business, so Stuart Webber will also be able to work out and have a say in finances and things, which is looked after by Ben Kensel, who's the Chief Operating Officer. And Stuart Webber has been a marvel in terms of what he helped create at Huddersfield, and then obviously creating it at Norwich, when I think a lot of us were expecting something far more mediocre over a number of seasons as Norwich tried to sort out their finances. Doing that, getting promoted at the same time, was quite remarkable. So the fact that Stuart's done that at 2 clubs is hugely impressive.
Yeah, can you give me a quick short list of some of the players that he's brought in? Because he's become renowned, I think, for that. For the scouting side of things, and I know that there were reports earlier in the season linking him to almost every other single Premier League club who are in the market for a sporting director. Who's he responsible for bringing in?
So, I mean, obviously you've got him, a recruitment team, analysts and statisticians and people like that who, some of them were already at the club, some have come in since Stuart's come in. But in terms of the players that have come in since Stuart Webber has been at the club, you basically have the entire side at the moment. Yeah. I would generally say there are players who've come up through the academy, like Max Aarons and Jamal Lewis, who were already in the academy, but then Stuart Webber has had a big say in actually them being promoted and saying, Daniel Farker, look at these guys, and Daniel going, yes. Ben Godfrey, a similar case. James Maddison was already at the club, but I would say a fair credit to Stuart Webber and Daniel Farker for not sending him back out on loan, because I think the manager who was there before him was going to do that this year if he'd kept his job. Emi Buendia, Teemu Pukki, Tim Krul, I mean, all of them, basically. There aren't many. Alex Tetty's probably the only player who as a senior player, who was already at the club off the top of my head. Todd Cantwell's another one who's come through the ranks. And Daniel, to back up Stuart, has done a really good job of bringing through the youth players, the younger players, but also having faith in them over a period of time rather than dipping them in and out. Now that, of course, might be trickier in the Premier League, but by the same token, the club want to increase the value of these players as a self-funding club. So you expect to see them continue to put the faith in them and hopefully learn from their mistakes. But the whole ethos of the club on the football side is basically down to Stuart Webber in the last 2 years. Yeah, I mean,
there's a kind of mysticism around sporting directors who do their job really well. And, they gain media notoriety now in a way that they weren't doing 5-10 years ago. Is it obvious to you what Stuart Webber has done differently since he's come in? Or obviously he's obviously contributed to the culture around the club if he's at the very top of all footballing matters, but is it obvious to you why he's become associated with positivity in the way that he has done?
Yeah, I think, the evidence is the key thing because of what he's achieved. But I think in terms of being around the club, there's a transparency that you don't see very often at many football clubs. I mean, Norwich have had a really difficult situation financially in the last 2 years, and the way that's been communicated to everyone has kind of helped with the expectations, and it's helped with the acceptance of the fan base. And some people could look at Norwich and Newcastle and see similar ways of clubs trying to deal with it, but the way it's being communicated is entirely different. I think there was a sense of bringing everything together. Now that is going to be sorely tested this year if things continue to go wrong. If Norwich don't win another game, then that's going to be very hard and a real test of it. So it is clearly easier when things are going well. But they did kind of ride out this first season under them both when it was really difficult and it was a huge transition. With people questioning what was going on, but this sort of acceptance that we'll give them time and we're going to put our faith in them as a supporter base. So I think that buy-in of people and leading something is probably the thing that's most impressive. But Stuart Webber has been fortunate, probably not quite the right word, but he's come into a job where he's been given that freedom to do it. He is a top dog really, as well as the people who are helping him, who no doubt he has a really close relationship with. So he's got that freedom. I don't know many clubs where the owners are willing to put their hands up and say, oh, here you go, let us know how you get on. And also he's astute in that he, at both Huddersfield and Norwich, he's brought in managers who are used to the model. And I think he mentioned that before the game on Friday, that it would be harder to bring in Tony Pulis as an example, or any English manager, because there'd be things there that they would want to do that, say, a coach who's used to working with a sporting director in their proper role would be like, well, I don't want to have to do that. I've already got enough to get on with.
And so in those distinctions, we mean things presumably Daniel Farke signs off on whether or not a player does actually come, but isn't necessarily responsible for the scouting itself?
100%, yeah. So, I mean, they won't bring in a player that Daniel doesn't want because that would be pointless.
Yeah.
So you're going to need Daniel to go, yeah, okay, I'll work with him.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is noticeable looking over the 2 and a bit years that, and I think this was said at the time, because Norwich haven't got much money, their recruitment is riskier. They do take gambles. So plenty of signings they brought in haven't really worked. Some where you'd have thought they would. And sometimes you look at it and wonder if maybe they are more Stuart Webber's sort of suggestions than players that Daniel Farke has maybe looked at over years. That's just a hunch I've got. But it is, in that way, that is something that Stewart is managing in terms of the budgeting as well, and ultimately probably instigating a huge amount of faith in Daniel Farke as Stuart Webber's job too. He isn't really under pressure at the moment individually, because I think everyone around Norwich kind of knows the situation that they're in, and providing nothing gets too embarrassing, are willing to continue to back it.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question. I mean, I'll ask you, Damien. Let's say that Norwich do get relegated this season. Do you want Daniel Farke to stay, presumably?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nice when that's the case, isn't it? I feel like that isn't the case very often. This is what I think about
you need
Norwich.
Consistency. I mean, he's got us promoted once, he can do it again.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not ideal, but as a personal preference, absolutely.
Mm. Okay, and you would agree with that, Alex, would you?
Yeah, and I'd also say similarly, if we go down, then we should try and keep hold of Ralph Hasenhüttl, because I think what's crucial, and I think this is to go back to Norwich, what Webber has done so effectively is to foster a sense of a footballing outlook. So the key thing, I think, particularly when you're working a sporting director alongside a manager, is that there has to be an overall template for how a side want to play. And that's balanced, I think, in terms of the resources available, the type of players that are coming through the youth system and how they're coached, finding a manager that's going to fit that style, and then empowering that manager through player acquisition, trust, and facilitating it in other ways.
But what about in this case, where the way in which the club want to play might need to be adapted to suit the league or to stay in the league?
I think there's a difference between strategy and tactics in that sense.
Okay.
So you can have an overall philosophy which may be, in maybe like 2 rigid banks of 4 and counter-attacking, or maybe possessional, or whatever it is, gegenpressing. There are different types. Obviously, within that, there is latitude to finesse that on a game-by-game basis, but you're not going to start seeing Norwich playing like Burnley, is my point.
Okay.
And then crucially, what you have to do is go and find players that will fit that style of play and fit that system, and also pair that with a manager who does that. And I think that's the greatest distinction between teams that have a sporting director who knows what they're doing and teams that don't. And this obviously is the German model, which is why people like Farke are more used to it, is that the manager is required to buy into that philosophy and is ideally recruited because they can implement it in terms of how they have previously coached. And the biggest single problem with teams who chop and change between managers is they chop and change often between styles. And obviously a playing squad may be geared towards one style or another, but if you're constantly moving around and going from a team that wants to sit deep to a team that wants to press, etc., clearly you're going to have problems because players aren't all equipped to do the same thing.
Mm. Okay, can I ask you both, Damien and Michael, about Delia Smith? And the reason I want to do that is, and let me just give you, this is probably a naive outsider's perspective, right? But the way that I look at Norwich, as I sort of hinted before when you were saying you'd be happy for Farke to stay in the event of relegation, is that Norwich is a really nice club where all nice things happen, and Delia Smith's really nice and everyone's very happy all the time. I know that's not really the case, right? But that's what I see. Can one of you, let's go with you, Damien, can you just explain to me and to our overseas listeners who may not realise the institution that Delia Smith is, who's Delia Smith?
Well,
why do I keep saying her name?
I think she started her career back in the 60s at the BBC.
Right.
In the early days of cookery programmes.
Yes.
Before cooks were, household celebrities.
Yeah.
So I think she forged her way into the cookery heart of the nation. And became an institution just like the BBC.
Yeah. She's the mother of the UK.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So she's a generation before the whole that nameless host of cooks and chefs that you have now.
Yeah.
And with her husband, who was a publisher, it sounds like a marriage made in heaven. They created a dynasty.
I mean,
and adopted the club when it was on its knees.
Right.
Very much so. Was it 20 years ago now, I guess.
As Norwich fans.
As Norwich fans, yeah. And they're describing themselves as majority shareholders, which they are. And I think in the last couple of years, again, with bringing in the new structure, they have stepped away a little bit more as they are, getting older in years. But the passion is absolutely still there, and if ever you described a club as a family club, I think you could apply that to Norwich.
Right. Yeah.
And it definitely comes from them. And Michael Wynne-Jones is passionate, as lovely character, and just exudes the club. And I guess it is absolutely unique in the Premiership, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's as I was saying to you, Michael, before we started recording, that when we do these podcasts and we try to cover a kind of broader range of things about the club that we're discussing, ownership always comes up, and it's nearly always, the most depressing part of the conversation. There's nearly always someone awful to discuss who's done awful things and who has somehow been allowed to buy a football club. I'm so pleased to be able to talk about Delia Smith, because it really doesn't feel like that. What is her reception like amongst supporters? Obviously, she's well liked by many, but is there a downside to it as well?
Well, I think what I would say is everyone looking from the outside into Norwich will have massive respect for what Delia and Michael represent as football owners.
Yeah.
And they would probably want their owners to be like that, open, honest, letting people do the job who have done it and can do it in terms of running the club around the place, accessible.
Supporters
as well. And I think a vast majority of Norwich City fans see them for what they are. The only issue, and it does only ever come up when times are tough, is that there is a ceiling to what they can achieve. I think because they have the money to invest. They had the money, ceiling, right? Exactly. They had the money to help the club and to save it effectively. And they've put in lots of money in the past at various times to keep it afloat or to achieve this and that. They've got all that money back. The club are in a position where they're internally and externally debt-free, although the accounts are in the middle of a season, which is more, I think the accounts, they've sort of, it's a snapshot where they do owe money, and by the time they finish the Premier League season, it'll be back on an even keel. So that's probably why it looks a bit worse at the moment than it would be. But essentially, the club is externally and internally debt-free, and that's great for a certain level, but it doesn't half make it difficult when I think you're trying to sustain yourself in the Premier League. I think it is a unique model in terms of what Norwich are trying to achieve this year. What Burnley have done is, they have owners who I think are a group of local business people, so they were able to invest and kind of just give them that enough money really to establish themselves, and now they're in a self-sustaining pattern, which is great. Norwich are trying to get into a self-sustaining pattern without that initial investment, which you can see is so hard. They've kind of done that by putting their faith into everything that got them there last year, but that's really hard. I mean, even under Paul Lambert back in 2011-12, when they'd had successive promotions, they spent a little bit of money to get there, and that was kind of what instigated the continuation of the momentum. And they actually did that on a budget, but still spent probably more money than they have done this time around. Right. So I think there's just a frustration when it gets tough at what the downside of the owners they have, but that's not to take away from everything else. Football fans are human. Norwich City fans have the same psychology as everyone else. If it's going poorly as they see it, then they want to work out why that is, and they generally want to blame someone. And Delia and Michael, in fairness, tend to get the stick when it's going badly, and then the managers and whoever get the praise when it's going well, which was different last year. Delia and Michael got a fair amount of the praise for what happened last year as well. That's why this season will be a test, even of the great. It's brilliant that we can sit here and say, look, we still want Daniel to be in charge, and we still want Norwich to keep building. And if they go down and go back up, it's brilliant. But so sociology and the way humans deal with things. If it's really tough, people get on the backs of things and they do want change, and that's a really difficult behaviour to deal with.
My concern as well would be that presumably the single biggest way that Norwich would be able to raise funds is through player sales. And of course, if your team has been relegated, you're not going to want to sell anyone in January unless you really super have to. And I know your recent piece, you said there's a small budget available for acquisitions in January, but you're not going to want to sell anyone, particularly with the injury problems you've had. So at that point, you then think, well, potentially players will have to be sold in the summer. And you've got a lot of interesting players that teams would want to buy, particularly the two fullbacks and Godfrey, I would suggest. But if you've just been relegated, then the value of those players diminishes for a variety of reasons, and you can't charge the kind of premium that maybe you could if you were able to stay up. So it seems to me there's kind of an inherent tension there as well, that the quality of the performance is at once going to be a bonus because it keeps you up, but it also has an kind of incumbent benefit in terms of then being able to realise value on those players.
100%. And I think that is a significant part of Norwich's model over these 3 years until they feel they can establish themselves and become self-sustaining. It does remind me of Southampton, because I used to look at Southampton producing these great players, selling them on for big money and then reinvesting, and that would be enough. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's great, but you can't keep doing that year on year, because eventually you won't have that player, or you'll not quite spend the money how you should have done. And now I'm seeing it thinking, well, that's what Norwich want to do, and I'm hoping it'll work. And it's hugely difficult to sustain. I mean, selling James, just looking at your board there at the bottom, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention it, but selling James Maddison 2 years ago, I mean, that got them out of by far Norwich's best player, got them out of their hole. Yeah. And then that money helped them bring in 3 or 4 players that created a championship winning squad. So
I think there is a difference though, if you compare and contrast the two things, and that the two clubs, the difference being the stability behind the scenes, because that's something that Southampton have lacked. And there was an article again on The Athletic, God, I sound like such a shill,
thanks, Alex.
that I think Carl and a couple of others did about the departure of Les Reed and the issues behind the scenes at Southampton. And like you say, if there is a conveyor belt of talent from the youth system, and Norwich, I guess, have some benefit in terms of their catchment area, they're fairly alone in that, apart from Ipswich, who we shall not name, sorry. It does help, because then you can hoover up these young players and ideally sell them off. But you have to have intelligent decision makers with a remit to be able to run those sides of things in situ for long periods of time to see that through. And if you start panicking, or if Stuart Webber gets taken off by a club with deeper pockets, which I think would be a great shame, because I don't think he'd get the latitude the people are linking him with Manchester United or whomsoever. He's not going to get to do the same job. It's, he would be hired on the basis of what he'd achieved and then not allowed to achieve the same thing again. But if he goes and you start to lose that stability, then the conveyor belt model does dry up. That's my experience as a Southampton fan. Sorry if that's a bit of a negative way of looking at things.
I take it, and also, I mean, it was the big news of earlier in this season that Stuart Webber had officially signed his new 3-year contract. I mean, it's quite a big thing to have a sporting director signing for a specific amount of time, because they are effectively the constant compared to a head coach who can come and go. That's one of the ideas behind the model. At the moment, Stuart Webber's contract is the same length as Daniel Farke. He said, means unless Norwich sack me, I won't be going anywhere, which is what he said, for 3 years, which is great. But also that at the end of those 3 years, I'm probably 99% off ski. So, there's a degree of succession planning that will have to take place. And that's going to be a huge appointment at that point in terms of how Norwich sustain whatever it is they've achieved up until that point.
What's the succession plan for Delia and Michael? Is there anything in mind? I mean, as we said,
it's a good question.
Tempt fate, but they are getting on in age, as you said. They've kind of stepped back a little bit this season and last season from direct responsibility with the club. Is there something in mind there?
So I spoke to them exclusively for The Athletic. You can read it all. There you go. That's the first time I've said it, so that's fine. I'm employed by them.
I've said it more than you have.
That's over at the website in 2 parts, and I asked them that, and they didn't really want to tell me, to be brutally honest. But I think they won't be going anywhere for as long as they can get to a game. And I don't think they have any plans to disappear or do anything different. They said that there is a succession plan in place, so I think they're conscious of it. I think it's notable that Tom Smith, their nephew, is on the board of directors. Have a lot of time for Tom and what his involvement might be beyond Delia and Michael is probably one avenue. It's interesting though, because they are open to people coming in. I think they would be open to selling if the right situation arose. But I mean,
what is the right situation?
Well, isn't that the $1 million question? I think probably another clone of Delia and Michael with more money turning up.
This is Mary Berry.
It has.
They don't grow on
Alan
trees.
Partridge.
It's Alan Partridge. He's busy. But you know, I do wonder whether there is an avenue for more Norfolk business people getting involved in the club. It strikes me that there can't. How are there not more people with a Norfolk background and a bit of money who wouldn't come into some sort of collegiate kind of way of running the club? It's always sort of evaded me as to why that isn't something that might well happen.
What did Ed Balls do when he was there?
Cool, that's a big question.
He was
chairman. He was chairman. He was on the board. I think he was there for probably a year and a half. I think did the chief exec job for a little bit after Jez Moxey left, wasn't it? That was an ill-fated appointment. And yeah, I think he sort of helped pop in and out and got involved in a few board meetings. But it's a thing with fans being involved at the top end.
Diplomatically put.
It's a thing with football fans being involved at the top end of the club, isn't it? Some are like, woohoo! and some, try to have an impact.
Okay, well, look, we're going to wrap things up in a moment, but can I first ask? I mean, I know it's an impossible question to answer. I don't know why I bother asking it at the end of every podcast, but I do, and I'm going to.
Thanks.
What are your expectations, your honest expectations? Do you feel like Norwich can dig themselves out of the hole?
Honestly, I think it's a real struggle because I think of the strength of the division, and I think I'm looking for too many people to step up. But we are still early, and there's a long way to go. So I'm certainly not writing them off, but I think it's going to be a real struggle for the rest of the season. So I just hope they do something that means everyone still has belief in what they're trying to do, and then you just hope that sees you through to whatever's next.
Damien?
I think things will improve. They can't get any worse. I'm optimistic. I think it's a little bit too early to panic. But things have to change and change quickly. And as I said earlier on, I think the month of December is going to be key. But I hang on confident that there will be 3 teams that will be worse than us.
Right, okay. Can I also say people should visit Norwich because what a lovely place it is.
Oh, it's a wonderful city.
Tell me about Norwich. Tell me about the city of Norwich.
We'd avoided swearing until you said
sorry.
You can edit that out.
Yeah. But tell me about Norwich. It's lovely, isn't it? It's got a special place in my heart. It really does. I love it.
A lot of my family live there, and whenever I've taken friends up to Norwich and Norfolk, they've all loved it.
Yeah,
and have gone back.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful county.
Tell you what, I went to Blakeney not that long ago.
I've been to Blakeney.
That place is I loved it.
Rolo's
it's weird.
favourite place.
The kind of it's got sort of moors out to the sea, and it was very misty when I was there, and it felt like I was in a Doctor Who episode. Or something.
There are also those weird windmills.
They got a lot of weird windmills there.
Yeah.
One on a boat, saw the seals.
They're not weird, man.
No, they're weird.
They're weird by virtue of their location. They're not in Holland.
It's quite windy on the coast.
Well, no, but they look more like Dutch windmills if you compare them with the ones that you get.
We're closer to Holland than Wales.
They are Dutch windmills.
Okay.
There's a lot of the history of Norfolk.
There's a lot of Dutch windmills.
It's low and flat and faces Holland.
And also the trading links with the wool and so forth.
If you look at a lot of Norfolk place names, they've got Dutch origin.
They really?
I didn't know that.
This is a whole other podcast.
Well, you asked about the history.
No, I'm genuinely fascinated. Do you have any predictions? I know you don't like predictions, but what do you feel like?
I'm probably more bullish than you are.
Thanks.
That's good.
Partly because what's going to happen come, I think, January, February, or probably towards the end of December, beginning of January, once there's money to be spent, there'll be 3 or 4 teams that will sack their managers. And I think that's a mistake, probably, because I think the new manager bounce is effectively a myth. So I would see that Norwich's continuity will be their strength when other failing teams don't have the same degree of confidence.
Are you also partly bullish because we bigged up Norwich so much?
Yeah,
It would be great
I look like a
if,
twat if they go down.
Well, maybe it's a case
No.
we've just got our crisis over earlier on in the season.
Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's a charge to the finish line now, hey?
I think they'll be all right.
Well, let's get back together in May and
Let's not.
Let's not.
Let's not.
Michael, thanks so much for
pleasure.
coming on. Really appreciate it. Please do go and read all of Michael's work at The Athletic. Tifo. Damien, thanks for coming also.
Pleasure.
Have you enjoyed yourself?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Alex, cheers. And we'll be back next week with James McNicholas, also from The Athletic. And we're going to talk about Arsenal, which I feel like, even though this has been quite a depressing conversation, that's going to be more depressing.
Well, how has this been depressing?
Hopefully
Well,
after
it
the
hasn't.
1st
That's
of
what I'm
December.
saying. It sort of should be. It feels like it should have been, but I don't think it has. Yeah,
But
you're
there's Dutch windmills
right. There's a lot of Dutch
and
windmills,
a sporting director. What's not to love?
True. Right, see you next week.